Sarah had just settled into bed, the soft glow of her phone the only light in the room. It was past midnight, and the house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you aware of every creak and groan. She had always hated this time of night, the hours where the world seemed to sleep, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Her husband was away on a business trip, and the empty side of the bed only amplified the loneliness. As she closed her eyes, hoping for the escape of sleep, her phone buzzed on the nightstand, the sound slicing through the silence like a knife. She reached for it, expecting a late-night message from a friend or perhaps an alert from one of the apps she had yet to silence. But what she saw on the screen made her blood run cold. The message was from a number she had deleted months ago, a number that belonged to her brother, Michael. Michael had died in a car accident last winter, his death sudden and tragic, leaving a void in her life that still ached every day. The message was simple, just one word: hello. Sarah stared at the screen, her mind racing to make sense of what she was seeing. It had to be a mistake, a glitch, or maybe someone had found his old phone and was playing a cruel joke. But deep down, she felt something darker, something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. Her fingers trembled as she typed back, "Who is this?" The response was immediate, as if whoever, or whatever, was on the other end had been waiting. "I need to see you," the reply read, the words filling her with a sense of dread so intense it was almost suffocating. She wanted to delete the message, to block the number and forget this had ever happened, but something compelled her to keep reading. The next message came before she could even think to respond. "It's Michael. Come to the house." The house. The old family home that had been abandoned since their parents had died. The house where Michael had grown up, and where Sarah had sworn never to return after his death. Her heart pounded in her chest as she threw off the covers and sat up in bed. This was impossible, she told herself. Michael was gone. She had seen his body, attended his funeral, laid flowers on his grave. Yet here she was, holding her phone with his words staring back at her. The rational part of her screamed to stop, to put the phone down and go back to sleep, but another part, a darker, more desperate part, needed to know the truth. Was it really Michael? Or was something far more sinister at play? With shaky hands, Sarah typed one last message: "What do you want?" The answer was chilling in its simplicity. "I want you to remember." Sarah's breath hitched as she read those final words, "I want you to remember." What could he possibly mean by that? Memories of her brother flooded back, a mix of happy childhood moments and the darker times they rarely spoke about. Michael had always been the rebellious one, the one who pushed boundaries, and there were things he had done that still haunted her. She tried to shake off the feeling, convincing herself that it was just a prank, but the unease gnawed at her, growing stronger with each passing second. She didn't realize she was already out of bed, pulling on a sweater and slipping on her shoes. It was like something was guiding her, a force she couldn't resist. The old house was only a 15-minute drive from her current home, yet she hadn't been there in years. The memories were too painful, the grief too fresh. As she started her car, the engine roared to life, but the usual comfort of its hum did nothing to ease the tension twisting in her gut. The streets were empty, bathed in the orange glow of streetlights, and the night seemed to stretch on forever. Every shadow felt ominous, every noise amplified. As she turned onto the old road that led to her childhood home, her mind wandered back to the last time she had been there. It was the day after Michael's funeral, and she had promised herself she would never return. The house had always felt off, even when they were kids. There were stories about the place, rumors that it was cursed, that bad things happened to those who lived there. But those were just stories, weren't they? The house came into view, its dark silhouette looming against the night sky. The windows were black, lifeless, and the front door hung slightly ajar, swaying with the breeze. Sarah parked the car at the end of the gravel driveway, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She could turn back now, leave this madness behind and go home. But something deep inside urged her forward, a need to know what was waiting for her inside. She stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at her skin, and approached the house. The closer she got, the more she felt the weight of the past pressing down on her. Memories of Michael's troubled teenage years, the fights with their parents, the secrets he kept, all bubbled to the surface. She reached the front door, hesitating for just a moment before pushing it open. The door creaked loudly, echoing through the empty hallways, and she stepped inside. The interior was just as she remembered it, dusty, cold, and filled with the remnants of a life long abandoned. Her footsteps echoed on the wooden floors as she walked through the house, each room bringing back memories she had tried so hard to forget. The living room, where they had spent countless Christmases, was now a shell of its former self, the furniture covered in white sheets like shrouds. The kitchen, where their mother had cooked their meals, was eerily silent, the clock on the wall frozen at a time long past. But it was the staircase that drew her in, the narrow wooden steps leading up to the second floor. She could feel a presence there, something waiting for her at the top. Her phone buzzed again, and she pulled it out, her heart skipping a beat as she read the message, "I'm upstairs." Sarah swallowed hard, her legs feeling like lead as she climbed the stairs. The air grew colder with each step, the darkness closing in around her. She reached the top and found herself standing in front of Michael's old bedroom door. It was closed, just as it had been the day he died. She reached out, her hand trembling as she turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was just as she remembered it, posters on the walls, his bed unmade, and his guitar leaning against the corner. But there was something different now, something that made her skin crawl. The temperature in the room was icy, her breath visible in the air. And there, in the middle of the room, was a figure. It was Michael, or at least it looked like him. But his face was twisted, his eyes filled with an unnatural hatred. "You left me," the figure hissed, its voice a distorted version of her brother's. "You left me to die." Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. The figure standing before her looked like Michael, but there was something deeply wrong with it, something that sent a chill down her spine. The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive, as if the walls were closing in on her. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't respond. It was as if the house itself was holding her in place, forcing her to confront this twisted version of her brother. "You left me," the figure repeated, its voice laced with bitterness and pain. "You abandoned me when I needed you the most." "No. No, I didn't," Sarah stammered, finally finding her voice. "I didn't know. I couldn't have known. Couldn't have known." The figure's face twisted into a cruel smile. "Or didn't want to know. You ignored the signs, Sarah. You knew something was wrong, but you were too wrapped up in your own life to care." The words cut through her like a knife, each accusation bringing with it a flood of guilt and regret. Deep down, she had always blamed herself for Michael's death, but she had buried those feelings, tried to move on. Now, they were being dragged to the surface, and she was forced to face the truth she had tried so hard to avoid. "I didn't abandon you, Michael," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I loved you. I still love you." The figure's eyes softened for a moment, and for a brief second, Sarah thought she saw the real Michael, the brother she had grown up with, the one who had always looked out for her. But then the darkness returned, and the figure's expression hardened. Love? If you loved me, you would have been there, it spat. You would have stopped me. Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I didn't know. I didn't know you were in so much pain. You didn't want to know, the figure corrected, stepping closer to her. You ignored the signs, Sarah. You pretended everything was fine while I was drowning in my own misery. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls darkening, the air growing colder. Sarah could feel the despair, the anger, the overwhelming sadness that had consumed Michael in his final days. She had been so focused on her own life, her own problems, that she hadn't seen the depth of his suffering. And now, it was too late. Michael, please. I'm sorry, she pleaded, her voice barely a whisper. If I could go back, I would do everything differently. I would have been there for you. The figure stopped, its head tilted as if considering her words. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, the figure reached out, its hand icy cold as it touched her cheek. You can't change the past, Sarah, it said, its voice softer now, almost sad. But you can make amends. You can help me find peace. How? Sarah asked, her heart pounding in her chest. What do I need to do? Remember, the figure said, its voice echoing in her mind. Remember what really happened that night. Sarah's mind reeled, trying to grasp what the figure was saying. What had she forgotten? She had replayed the events of that night over and over in her mind, but nothing had ever stood out. What was she missing? As she struggled to remember, the room began to change. The walls seemed to warp, the floor shifting beneath her feet. The house was no longer the abandoned shell it had been when she arrived. Instead, it was as it had been on that night, full of life, full of the memories she had tried so hard to forget. She was back in the past, reliving that fateful night. The night when everything had changed. The world around Sarah blurred, and suddenly she was no longer standing in the cold, abandoned house. Instead, she was back in the warmth of a home filled with life, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the air. The walls were adorned with family photos, the furniture arranged just as it had been when they were children. It was the night everything fell apart, the night Michael died. She watched herself from a distance, as if she were an observer in her own memory. There she was, sitting on the couch, her phone in hand, typing furiously. She was so engrossed in her conversation that she barely noticed Michael as he walked in, his face pale, eyes sunken with a weariness that only comes from deep emotional pain. Sarah, he had said, his voice barely above a whisper. But she hadn't looked up, hadn't seen the desperation in his eyes. She had mumbled a response, too caught up in her own world to pay attention to her brother who was standing on the edge of a precipice. In this relived moment, Sarah wanted to scream at herself, to tell her past self to look up, to see Michael, to stop him before it was too late. But the scene continued to play out, unstoppable, inevitable. Michael had tried again, his voice trembling as he said, "I need to talk to you." Again, she had brushed him off, telling him she was busy, promising they could talk later. But later never came. Michael had turned and left the room, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He had looked back at her one last time, a silent plea for help that went unnoticed. Sarah's heart broke as she watched the scene unfold. She could see it all now, the signs she had missed, the pain in his eyes, the way he had hesitated before leaving. He had been asking for help, begging her to see him, but she had been too wrapped up in her own life to notice. The memory shifted, and now she was in Michael's room. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, his phone in his hand, the screen glowing in the dim light. She watched as he scrolled through his messages, stopping at one that she couldn't quite see. He read it over and over again, his expression growing darker with each passing second. Then, he began to type. She couldn't see the words, but she knew they were filled with anger, with frustration, with the deep-seated pain that had been eating away at him for months. He sent the message, and then threw his phone down on the bed. The screen went dark, and so did the room. Sarah wanted to run to him, to shake him, to tell him that she was there for him, that she cared. But she was powerless, trapped in the memory, forced to watch as Michael made the decision that would change everything. He stood up, moving to his desk, where a small bottle of pills sat. He opened it, the sound of the pills rattling inside echoing in the silence. Sarah's heart raced as she realized what was about to happen. She wanted to scream, to stop him, but she couldn't. This was a memory, and no matter how much she wished it would end differently, it wouldn't. Michael swallowed the pills, one by one, his face calm, almost resigned. He lay down on his bed, closing his eyes, the darkness swallowing him whole. And just like that, he was gone. The scene faded, and Sarah was back in the present, standing in Michael's room, tears streaming down her face. The figure that looked like Michael stood before her, watching her with those same sad, haunted eyes. "Now you remember," it said softly. "You were too late." Sarah fell to her knees, the weight of her guilt crushing her. She had failed him. She had been too blind, too caught up in her own life to see the signs, and now Michael was gone because of it. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice choked with sobs. "I'm so sorry." The figure knelt beside her, its cold hand resting on her shoulder. "It's too late for apologies, Sarah. But it's not too late to make amends." "What can I do?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Tell the truth," the figure said. "Tell everyone what really happened that night. Don't hide from it anymore. Don't let my memory be tainted by lies." Sarah nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of her promise. She would tell the truth. She would make sure everyone knew what really happened to Michael. It was the least she could do for him now. The figure began to fade, its form dissolving into the darkness. But before it disappeared completely, it looked at her one last time, and she saw a glimmer of the brother she had lost. "Thank you," it whispered, and then it was gone. Sarah was left alone in the dark, the silence of the house pressing in on her. But this time, the silence felt different, less oppressive, more peaceful. She had remembered. She had faced the truth. And now, she could begin to heal. The days that followed were a blur for Sarah. The weight of the memory, the revelation of what truly happened that night, hung over her like a dark cloud. She knew what she had to do, but the thought of facing it, of speaking the truth out loud, terrified her. For so long, she had kept the memory buried, hidden beneath layers of denial and guilt. But now, the truth was out, and there was no turning back. She spent hours drafting and redrafting her message, the one she would share with the world, with her family, and with those who had known Michael. Every word felt heavy, each sentence a knife twisting deeper into the wound she had carried for so long. But as difficult as it was, she knew it was necessary. She owed it to Michael, to herself, to finally set the record straight. When she was ready, she posted the message online, sharing it on social media, in emails to friends and family. and even in a local support group she had joined. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People reached out with messages of support, others shared their own stories of loss and guilt, and some simply offered a listening ear. It was as if a dam had burst, releasing a flood of emotions she had kept bottled up for too long. But with the support came the questions. People wanted to know more, what Michael had been going through, why she hadn't seen the signs, and how she had finally come to terms with the truth. Each conversation was a painful reminder of her own failures, but it was also a step toward healing. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, she could find peace. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah found herself returning to the old house more and more often. It had once been a place of pain, a symbol of everything she had lost, but now it was something different. It was a place of reflection, a place where she could remember Michael not as the tragic figure she had come to see him as, but as the brother she had loved, the one who had been full of life and potential. She spent hours in his room, sorting through his things, reading old letters, and looking at photographs. Each item was a piece of the puzzle, a glimpse into the life he had lived, the struggles he had faced, and the person he had been. It was painful, but it was also cathartic. With each memory she uncovered, she felt a little more connected to him, a little more at peace with what had happened. One evening, as she was sitting on the edge of Michael's bed, her phone buzzed in her pocket. For a moment, her heart raced, the memory of that first message still fresh in her mind. But when she looked at the screen, she saw it was just a text from a friend, checking in on her. She smiled, the fear slowly ebbing away, replaced by a sense of calm she hadn't felt in a long time. She put the phone down and lay back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt oppressive. It felt peaceful, almost comforting. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to relax, to let go of the tension she had been carrying for so long. And that's when she heard it, a faint sound, like the soft chiming of a bell, or the distant echo of a voice. She sat up, listening intently, but the sound was gone. She shook her head, telling herself it was just her imagination, a trick of the mind. But as she lay back down, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. It wasn't a threatening presence, not like before. It was something different, something warmer. She closed her eyes again, and this time, she let herself drift off to sleep. In her dreams, she saw Michael, not the twisted, vengeful figure she had faced that night, but the brother she had loved, the one who had always been there for her. He was smiling, his eyes bright and full of life, and he reached out to her, his hand warm and comforting. "Thank you," he said, his voice clear and strong. "You've given me peace." Sarah woke with a start, the dream still vivid in her mind. The room was bathed in the soft light of dawn, and for the first time in years, she felt truly at peace. The house was no longer a place of pain, but a place of healing, a place where she could finally let go of the past and look toward the future. She got up, feeling lighter than she had in a long time, and walked to the window. The morning sun was rising, casting a warm glow over the landscape. As she stood there, she knew that while she would never forget Michael, she could finally move on, free from the guilt and the pain that had haunted her for so long. And in that moment, she knew that Michael was at peace too, and that he would always be with her, a silent guardian watching over her, guiding her toward a brighter future.